Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to be taking a huge undertaking here. We're going to be kicking off our War of the Spark limited set review, and I figured I would switch it up a little bit since this set is all about Planeswalkers. We are going to do an entire separate video evaluating every single Planeswalker. The entire set is just based around them. It bleeds Planeswalkers on every single card. So I figure it's worth breaking down the Planeswalkers into different tiers and looking at the ones that you're interested in drafting, the ones that are going to take away the gains, and the ones that are just going to fill, your usual role in a limited set. There's a lot to talk about here, and it's going to be quite daunting to just, evaluate 36 different Planeswalkers across a bunch of different rarities with a bunch of different abilities, including a passive ability on every single one. It's a lot. So I imagine this first episode of this limited set review will go on for a little bit. So I'll try not to drone on about too many of the walkers. I'll try to keep it neat and succinct, and we'll get into the individual colors with subsequent videos in this series. So before we get started, make sure you subscribe below to the channel and keep track of the limited set review for War of the Spark. I'll be trying to do one video a day, which might not work in a perfect schedule, but that's the goal. And yeah, find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarocks and tell me which Planeswalkers you are most excited about for limited. So a couple things here before we actually get into the tiers. Since the set is very much centered around Planeswalkers, and Wizards of the Coast didn't want every single Planeswalker to just run away with the game, you're going to see a couple themes here. The removal in this set is much, much better than normal, which we'll keep in mind when we're looking at these Planeswalkers. The creatures seem to be very, very good with a lot of activated abilities, a lot of ways to become unblockable, a lot of evasion, so on and so forth. And then the Planeswalkers themselves, there are a lot of them that are designed to tick down and then just stay on the board with a couple counters, which is there to either work with Proliferate or to, be used as some sort of fodder for a sacrifice effect or so on and so forth. I would have to do a whole separate video on how to tackle dealing with an opponent's Planeswalker, so we're not really going to deal with the competitive side of how to deal with Planeswalkers in this video. I just want to go through and give initial reactions to each of the Planeswalkers in the set. So I've got these tiered differently than I'll normally do my videos. Normally I kind of tell you when I'd be drafting it, like whether I draft within the first couple cards or the last couple cards or the middle of the pack, so on and so forth. I'm going to be doing these in tiers, starting with what I consider the sideboard Planeswalkers, or the really niche build-around Planeswalkers, and in some cases, maybe the completely unplayable Planeswalkers. These are ones that aren't necessarily terrible, but they take a specific kind of deck or a specific kind of opponent to really shine, and they don't just go in every single deck, and you'll see that for the first couple walkers here. So let's go and kick things off here with colorless Planeswalker, Karn, the Great Creator. This one's 4 colorless mana, 5 loyalty. It is a rare, and its passive says, active abilities of artifacts your opponent's control can't be activated. So we're going to have to look at every single passive separately from the abilities and decide whether, the passive is one of the selling points of the card, or if it's just there as kind of a little bit of a bonus, or if it really even matters at all. There are some that just don't really seem to matter very much. In the case of Karn, there aren't that many artifacts floating around here, especially not ones with activated abilities, so we're not super concerned about Karn's passive ability, so let's look to his loyalty abilities. The first one, +1, says, until your next turn, up to 1 target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost. So you can take, say, a 5-mana non-creature artifact and turn it into a 5/5 for the turn. You can also use this on your opponent's creatures, and if they have activated abilities, or rather, you can use it on your opponent's artifacts, and if they have activated abilities, they can no longer use them until your next turn. But for the most part, this is a build-around type effect that incentivizes you to have a bunch of non-creature artifacts, which, again, there aren't that many of in the set. Karn has a -2 as well that says, you may choose an artifact card you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal that card and put it into your hand. If you're a newer player, when it says outside the game, that's referring to your sideboard in a game of Limited. So again, if you have artifacts that are worth running, they're probably in your main board, and they're probably not exiled either. So Karn's -2, again, not very good. This really is going to function better if you have a bunch of non-creature artifacts. And again, there aren't that many floating around the set, and you really just don't have time in a format based on card advantage machines like Planeswalkers to be sitting around casting non-creature spells and stuff like that. So I expect Karn to be quite bad. Maybe he shows up, maybe he locks your opponent out of certain key artifacts, but I don't think Karn is going to be too splashy of a card here. Next up, we have the Wanderer, whoever that may be, 3 and a white for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. And you see the template in that we're going to see on a lot of these uncommon Planeswalkers here. They start at 5 loyalty, they tick down with a -2, and then they have no plus ability. So once they've ticked down twice, you're left with just the passive ability. And a lot of times when I'm evaluating these cards, I'm going to be running under the assumption that you can activate the -2 both times and see if that is worth the entire card altogether. Plus, you have to keep in mind sometimes you'll -2 right away and then the Planeswalker will die. And we also have to consider, is it worth it if you only get to activate it once and then your opponent kills the Planeswalker? So that's kind of the template I'm going to be using for these uncommon walkers that only tick down. So in the case of the Wanderer, the passive ability is prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and other permanents you control. So this stops burn damage, this stops, incidental damage, ping and stuff like that. Doesn't stop combat damage, which is the majority of the damage that will be dealt to your permanents, but there are some red decks that will cry a little bit. Not to mention a lot of the black burn, quote unquote, has been changed to damage rather than, life loss and stuff like that. So the Wanderer protects you marginally against certain types of cards, but not altogether. The Wanderer also has a -2 ability that says exile target creature with power 4 or greater. So a very sideboard-esque type ability that's very likely to matter in the main board. Almost every deck will have some sort of creature that this can target, but there will be control decks out there and decks that just don't care about too many creatures. They're playing more spell card advantage. They have Planeswalkers, stuff like that. And the -2 could just be completely blank. Think the card Bring to Trial from, Ravnica Allegiance, maybe Guilds of Ravnica, the one that does the same thing, exile target creature with power 4 or greater. Sometimes it's just a blank card in your hand, and sometimes the Wanderer's ability will be completely blank. Against big creature decks, the Wanderer is going to be great, but it's the type of walker I'm not looking to pick up early. Maybe boarded in against red decks with a lot of burn or green decks with a lot of big creatures, but otherwise, I think this is one of the weaker Planeswalkers in this set. Next up, it really pains me to put Tamio this low on the list, but I don't think this Tamio is very good. Tamio, Collector of Tales, is 2 green, blue, 4 mana total for a 5 loyalty walker. This one's a rare, and it says spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause you to discard cards or sacrifice permanents. So your opponent can't make you discard, your opponent can't make you sacrifice anything. And, that's not really a selling point here. A lot of decks won't even care about that ability. It is a nice little hoser against some of the other Planeswalkers that we'll see. But it's not the selling point for Tamio. It's just a nice little bonus to have attached to a card that you might already be interested in playing. But anyway, I digress. Tamio's +1 says choose a non-land card name, then reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all the cards with the chosen name from among them into your hand and put the rest into your graveyard. So essentially, you name a card, you mill yourself 4, and if the named card is in those 4, you get to put it in your hand. This is very unreliable draw unless you have a bunch of copies of a specific card. And the thing I really don't like about this is that it puts the rest of cards into your graveyard. And this is not really a set where the graveyard matters too much, where you can reliably get stuff back from your graveyard. So a lot of times, if you tick up Tamio too much, you actually run the risk of milling yourself out, and that's not great, especially since there are some actual mill support cards in this set that your opponent could be playing. Tamio's plus is here to synergize with her minus, which is a -3 that says return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So clearly you +1 trying to hit very specific set of cards or whatever you have multiples in your deck of, and then you -3 to get back some of the other cards that were incidentally milled. A lot of times if you play Tamio, you're probably just going to run her out there and -3 right away, but think about that. 4 mana sorcery, get a card back from your graveyard to your hand. That's not very good at all. And you have to plus her at least once in order to -3 her twice. And I just don't think your opponent's going to let that happen. And it's just sad, right? So I don't think this is a reliable card. If you're really interested on recycling certain cards from your graveyard back to your hand and recasting them, then sure, Tamio is not terrible, but it's also just not that great and not very reliable either. Next in this category, we have a card that, this of all of them, might be the one I'm underrating the most, but I'm just not seeing it at the moment. Shiok Dream Render is 1 blue-black, so 3 mana total, 2 hybrid Dimir mana. For a 5 loyalty, uncommon walker. It says spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library. So your opponent can't search their library. They can't crack and evolve in wilds or, an effect like that and search at all. If they do, you just have to remind them, hey, you can't do that, and whatever effect they had that was letting them search the library, it just doesn't do anything. And that seems like throwaway text a lot of the time, but it'll get somebody, right? They'll try to cast a spell that searches their library, and you'll just have to say, nope, can't do it, and boom, they wasted their spell. Shiok's big selling point here is the -1 that says target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. So clearly kind of like a commander shoe-in, but we're talking about limited, and I don't think Shiok quite gets the job done. Now, if Shiok sits here and minuses 5 times, maybe you proliferate it, you keep going, right? Just on her own, she can mill 20 cards from the opponent with no help at all. But she is going to get attacked, right? You can't assume that Shiok's just going to be able to -1 over and over and over and over again without being pressured, without being destroyed. And if you minus her like 3 times and mill 12 cards, and then your opponent kills her, and you don't have any other mill to support Shiok, you kind of just wasted a card, right? Shiok is more of the build around type card that I'm referring to here than it is a sideboard or unplayable card. I think she has potential, especially in multiples. If you completely exhaust an Shiok and then play another one and keep minusing, you could kill your opponent with that, but it requires a very controlling deck, and there's so many ways to deal with Planeswalkers in this set that I'm just not seeing it as a primary game plan, more of a backup game plan or a sideboard game plan against decks that are playing maybe cards like Tamio that care about their graveyard. Last on this list, we have Watley, the Sun's Heart. Sorry, Watley, not cutting it for me. 2 and a single green-white hybrid mana, 3 mana total for a 7 loyalty walker. Uncommon, and it has the Doran ability, or the Arcades High Alert ability. It says each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Note that there's nothing there about defenders, so you can't start jamming with your defenders. Your creatures just deal damage based on their butts rather than their power. The -3 says you gain life equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control. We got just out of a format where we were playing a similar card in High Alert, but Watley is not High Alert. I don't think this set really supports high toughness creatures, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the creatures are already pretty pushed in their power to mana cost ratio, and just making your high toughness creatures a little bit better isn't always going to be a fantastic way of combating the already pushed high power level creatures in the set. And then the life gain ability, if that's all she does, then sure, whatever. You gain 6 to 10 life off of Watley, and then she dies, then I don't really think that's worth a card either. I don't think she's worth building around. There's not a lot of high toughness payoff, and she can't interact with actual defenders, which there are a couple of in the set. So I'm assuming Watley is probably one of the worst Planeswalkers in the set, unless you have a very specific deck. But you'll know when you have that deck. You'll just have a bunch of high toughness creatures that don't have defender, and if that comes together for you, then sure, I guess there's something there. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and go with my gut on this one and say stay away from Watley for now. All right, the next category, we have kind of what I consider the low-tier Planeswalkers. These are ones that you are going to put in your deck basically every time you have them, but they're not going to have an extremely high impact on the game. They might be able to -1s, +1s, and then if they die off, they'll leave behind a very minor kind of effect on the board, or they give you a minor Karn advantage. They're not going to completely steal the game, and a lot of times they don't have a way to kind of have a lasting impact over the course of the game anyway, even if they don't die. First one, another one that might be underrated, but it takes a very specific kind of deck, is Kiora Behemoth Beckoner. This is 3 mana total, one of which has to be blue or green, so Simic Hybrid Planeswalker. 7 loyalty, uncommon, and the big selling point here is the passive ability, which says whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So clearly there's a kind of draw engine there, and it's in her passive ability, which could be quite nice. But I'm a little bit skeptical how many decks you're going to have where you just have a bunch of giant 4-power creatures. I know I said the power level of the creatures is pushed, but it's pushed for their mana cost, right? There's a lot of good 3/2 mana creatures that don't have 4 power that you're going to end up playing, and you're not going to have a deck that's just completely full of gigantic, enormous creatures. Her -1 says untap target permanent, so this does a couple things, but for the most part, it's going to be ramp. Kiora is going to let you untap a land and then use that land again, and this lets you kind of ramp a little bit. The thing I really just don't like about Kiora is that she does have a little bit of an expiration date on her. Even though she starts off with 7 loyalty, she doesn't protect herself too well, and if your opponent deems that, her card draw engine type ability is a little bit too good, your opponent can just start pinging her down and shooting her down, and, she doesn't protect herself very well. She doesn't make any creatures. She does pay you off for having creatures, but that alone isn't enough to carry a game. So I think Kiora is going to be a card that you'll put in your Simic decks, you'll put in your green or blue decks if you have something to do with the extra mana that she can provide, but otherwise, I don't think she's amazing. The Dovan is back. Dovan Hand of Control is the Azorius hybrid Planeswalker, 2 and a single white-blue, 3 mana total for a 5 loyalty uncommon. And the passive here says artifacts, instants, and sorceries your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast. Not a huge effect, but it is an annoying enough effect that it will change the way your opponent has to play a little bit. They can't always curve out to the point where they can cast 2 spells in the same turn, and if you're on the play, you might be able to just time walk them once early on. They're holding a 4 mana spell, they can't cast it on turn 4, they have to wait a turn, something like that. But it only affects instants and sorceries, and to a lesser extent, artifacts, which we've already mentioned, there aren't a lot of those running around. So your opponent's still free to cast their planeswalkers and cast their creatures with no extra tax, and that really kind of takes away from the passive here. The big selling point for Dovan is his -1, which says until your next turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to and dealt by target permanent an opponent controls. When I initially read this, I thought Dovan could target one of your planeswalkers, and then that planeswalker just couldn't take damage next turn, and they would have to start attacking Dovan. But the problem is this has to target an opponent's permanent, so basically Dovan says no, that creature can't deal damage next turn, and he gets to do this quite a bit since he only -1s and he starts at 5. Your opponent only has 1 creature. This can really stop an assault from your opponent, and I think Dovan will play well with your other planeswalkers since it kind of protects your other planeswalkers from your opponent's most threatening creature. Think of Dovan as kind of a tapper, right? A tapper that eventually dies off if you can't proliferate him. He stops your opponent's best creature from being relevant in combat, and that's about all he does. It also is kind of annoying that it prevents the damage dealt to the targeted creature, so you can't even really attack through their creature and start pressuring whatever planeswalker they have on board, since Dovan's ability says their blocker won't take any damage. But I don't know. I don't think Dovan's great here. I think it could be a little bit of a dirtily card if you have a planeswalker that needs the plus and you just need to hold off creatures and you're playing a really controlling deck. Then sure, Dovan will be fine as a support card, but he's not a primary plan, and I don't think he's that amazing even when he is doing what he's supposed to be doing. Next up is Teo, the Shield Mage, our little teenager shield man. 2 and a white for a 5 loyalty uncommon planeswalker. You have Hexproof, which is the passive. Not super relevant. Could be okay against some of the edict effects where your opponent can make target player sacrifice a creature or something along those lines. But for the most part, that line of text doesn't come up too often in a game of Limited. And the -2 here creates a 0/3 white wall token with Defender. That's fine, right? If Teo minuses twice and then just sits on board, he makes 6 toughness worth of blockers, but they're 0/3, so even at some point, normal creatures are going to be able to just smash into that, and it doesn't pressure them. I wish he made like 1/3s or something like that, so they can't just freely attack all of their creatures through them when they get to the point that they have enough creatures to do that. The walls just aren't that threatening. They don't pressure your opponent's planeswalkers either. Teo's a lot like Dovan here, where he's just here as a support card. I envision there's some sort of deck with like Teo and Watley or whatever, but that just seems bad to me, and I just don't really think Teo's that good. If you need to protect your planeswalkers, if you need blockers, if your opponent's playing some really aggressive deck with 2 power creatures and stuff like that, then sure, Teo will get the job done, but otherwise, he's not that good, and I would leave him alone for the early parts of this format. We have Davereal, Kylo Ren, the Rogue Shadow Mage, 2 and a black for a 3 loyalty uncommon planeswalker. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if they have 1 or fewer cards in hand, Davereal deals 2 damage to them, and then the -1 says target player discards a card. Now, this is the type of card that could be very, very annoying for some decks, especially if you can proliferate it. You can just keep your opponent's hand empty throughout the course of the game, and that can be devastating. If you imagine that this ticks down 3 turns in a row, then essentially what you got in total was 3 mana, target player discards 3 cards, which I think would be a very strong limited card, right? You just don't see that sort of rate for discard on making your opponent essentially discard their whole hand. The problem is that Davereal doesn't protect himself, and it's very likely that if you're on the draw or something along those lines, your opponent plays a 2-drop, and then you play Davereal on turn 3 and -1, they discard a card, and then they kill Davereal, and you paid 3 mana to make your opponent discard a card. So Davereal needs backup, right? He's one of the planeswalkers where you're playing something like Teo, and you need to protect him with your creatures, or you need to make sure that your opponent's creatures can't deal with him, and then he gets a little bit better. Davereal also, I guess, loses a little bit of value as the game goes on when your opponent's less likely to have a bunch of cards in their hand, and then he kind of makes up for it with his passive ability, where he can just consistently deal damage to your opponent as the course of the game goes on. But for the most part, he's the planeswalker that's easy to deal with, even though he can't be completely ignored. I think one of the reasons I'm really ragging on him is I hate the effect they did on the card with the shadows going over his name. I think it looks a little bit weird and tacky, but that's just a personal preference and not something that's specific to his effect. I think he's fine. You'll play him when you're in black, but there are times where he's just going to be a little bit embarrassing, even if he's always going to get at least 1 card out of your opponent's hand. Jinyoung, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, Wildcrafter, is 2 and a green for a 3 loyalty Yengu Planeswalker, and the passive here says each creature you control with a +1 counter can tap for any 1 mana of any color. And yeah, I guess that's fine. There's a lot of stuff that throws around +1 counters, including Yengu himself, since his -1 says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And this is a set where Proliferate exists. So if you're able to stick counters on creatures with Yengu's -1, and then you're able to proliferate, then you have a bunch of extra mana floating around with his passive ability. I don't think that's going to come up too often. It could let you ramp out some big creatures, but I think this format's going to be a lot about the kind of early to middle game and solidifying some sort of defense, or at least some sort of really strong offense to keep your opponent off of their card advantage engines. And I'm not sure Jinyoung fits in there very well. The -1 is fine, but if you pay 3 mana to put 3/+1 counters on a creature, and that is barring, Jinyoung being attacked at all, then I guess that's fine. 3 mana, put 3/+1 counters on a creature, spread out however you want over the course of a couple turns. That's fine, but it's not game breaking. I think he's pretty low tier. I think he's pretty low impact overall, because if you -1, same with Davereal, if you -1, you put a counter on a creature and then Jinyoung dies, then he just kind of didn't do anything. Plus, if this is the first card you cast in the game, he just sits there and does literally nothing. He doesn't do anything if you don't already have creatures on board, which is something we'll see with a couple other walkers, that they're not relevant if there are no creatures on board. And I think Yengu kind of shows what a Planeswalker needs to be doing in order to be viable, or at least be very good in this set. And I just don't think he's that good. All right, so now we're moving into our middle tier. These are the cards that I think are quite average. They're, again, not game-breaking. Your opponent, if they don't deal with them over the course of a couple turns, isn't just going to lose the game, but they should be trying to deal with them because they have lasting effect on the game. These are ones that you're happy to take a little bit earlier in the draft. They're probably not wheeling, and they're all quite good. A lot of them for their passive abilities, but their active abilities are going to be great as well. Let's go ahead and start off with Braska Swarms Eminence. This is the Golgari hybrid Planeswalker. 2 and black, green, so 4 mana total. Braska starts with 5 loyalty. It is uncommon, and it says whenever a creature you control with Death Touch, wink wink, deals damage to a player or a Planeswalker, put a 1/1 counter on that creature. And then the -2 creates a 1/1 black assassin creature with Death Touch, and the ability, whenever it deals damage to a Planeswalker, destroy that Planeswalker. So it gives the tokens kind of a Planeswalker Death Touch, if you will, since Death Touch is not worded in a way that it actually kills Planeswalkers. But anyway, what you get out of Braska if she minuses twice is 2 1/1 Death Touchers, and that already is pretty annoying. They're good defense and good offense since they can attack into Planeswalkers, and your opponent has to do something, right? You're always going to get a card out of that Death Toucher, whether it's a blocker, whether it's a removal spell, whether it's the Planeswalker it's attacking. A Death Toucher will always kind of get the card from the opponent. The opponent has the choice what card they want to trade for the Death Toucher, but Braska makes 2 of them if she survives, and she's pretty good at protecting herself. She comes down, she minuses, she makes a Death Toucher, and if your opponent can't kill her or isn't willing to trade off for that Death Toucher, she gets to go ahead and minus again. Her passive I don't think is amazing. If the Death Toucher manages to connect and kill a Planeswalker or deal damage to your opponent, it gets a little bit bigger. That could be, a little bit of a snowball type effect, but I don't think that's the selling point here. I think Braska gives you the value that you want out of your typical Planeswalker, and it gives you a good offense and defense at the same time. So I'm looking to pick this card a little bit higher than all of the low tier Planeswalkers I just talked about, even if it's, again, not game busting. Your opponent can just trade a couple things for the Death Touchers, and then Braska just sits there and looks a little bit sad. There's not a lot of other Death Touchers in the set either, but they do play well with Braska. So once you have a Braska in your pool, you're prioritizing Death Touch creatures a tiny bit higher than you normally would. Samut, Tyrant Smasher, dumb name, is back. 2 red-green, 4 mana total, 2 of which is hybrid Gruul mana. This is very similar templating. It's 5 loyalty, it's an uncommon, and it gives all of your creatures haste as the passive ability. It's nice to just have haste when you're not paying too much of a premium here, but I don't think that's worth a card. You wouldn't play a 4 mana enchantment that said all of your creatures have haste. That just wouldn't be good, right? So let's look to Samut's minus, which is a -1, and it gives target creature +2/+1 and haste until end of turn. Plus they kind of tacked a Scry 1 on here. We'll see that a lot in the later videos in this set. There's just Scry 1 attached to everything for some reason. But yeah, this is fine. If you're wondering why the -1 also gives haste, it's because if Samut is at 1 loyalty and you -1, the passive ability will no longer be there since Samut will be dead. So they also give the ability haste as well, so that your creature will have haste no matter what. I think this is fine. I wish she plussed and did this, but she can be quite aggressive. She can be the type of card that sits on board and threatens your opponent's Planeswalker quite a bit, or at least threatens them, right? There will be some points in the game where you no longer care about your opponent's Planeswalkers, you just care about getting them dead, and Samut plays kind of a similar role to something like Rhythm of the Wild, where every creature you play from that point forward could be a real threat. And honestly, you don't really need to Rhythm of the Wild out 5 creatures for it to be super relevant. Samut kind of has, like a lot of these Planeswalkers, an expiration date. She will eventually die if she minuses too much, but you're going to be the aggressor when you're playing this card, and a lot of times your opponent's going to be on defense. So Samut's one of the ones that might get the full value out of her minuses, and it lasts for quite a while. So I think she's fine. Not game-breaking, but fine. Nakiri is next with some real throwaway text. Nakiri Storm of Stone is 4 mana. This is the Boros hybrid Planeswalker, so 2 red, white, red, white. 6 loyalty to start off with, quite high, and uncommon. And it says, as long as it's your turn, creatures you control have first strike, and equip abilities you activate cost 1 less to activate. I should say at the recording of this video, there's about 30 cards that haven't been spoiled yet, but none of the cards that have been spoiled are equipment, so I don't know if that equip activation clause matters at all in this set. It's just kind of like Nahiri's flavor that she cares about equipment, so I guess that's why that's there. But regardless, the fact that all your creatures have first strike on your turn, again, like Sama, it makes you the aggressor. They don't have first strike on your opponent's turn, so your creatures are better attackers than they are blockers, just on account of having a Nahiri on board. So I think that's something to keep in mind there. And then the -X here says Nahiri deals X damage to target tapped creature. A little bit awkward that it has to be tapped. That usually means that your opponent got a swing out of it, or, you know, they've already killed a creature, you weren't able to block it, something along those lines. So the -X is a little bit awkward, but you would still play, you know, a sorcery that said destroy target tapped creature or something along those lines. We see effects like that quite often, and Nahiri is quite a bit better than that since she can split up her loyalty between different creatures over the course of a couple turns. I think there's going to be a play pattern when you play a Nahiri. If you're unable to attack, your opponent just won't attack you unless they have a very profitable attack, since you can just then kill off their creatures with Nahiri. So, I don't know, she's a little bit awkward, but she's quite good. Any of these Planeswalkers that come down and function as removal spells, even if it's sorcery speed, I think they're going to be decent, and Nahiri is kind of the first highlight we've seen with that minus destroy target creature type ability attached to her. Saheeli is up next. Saheeli Sublime Artificer is 3 mana total. She is the Izzet hybrid Planeswalker. 1 and 2 blue-red, blue-red. 3 mana total, 5 loyalty, uncommon. The selling point for me here is actually the passive, which says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. We'll talk about this more as the videos go on, but blue-red has a very heavy theme of spells matters, cast in instants, sorceries, non-creature spells in general, and Saheeli makes a 1/1 every time you cast one of those, which are great blockers. They can pressure your opponent. There are a couple other cards in this set, not many, but there are a couple other cards that care about artifacts, and Saheeli can produce those. Plus, if you have a deck that has a couple Planeswalkers in it, maybe 3 or 4, she does make servos whenever you cast a Planeswalker, which gives you a free block for each of those walkers. The -2 is a little weird. It says target artifact you control becomes a copy of another target artifact or creature you control until end of turn, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. 10 points every time you say the word artifact, I guess. So basically you take an artifact and you turn it into another creature or another artifact that you already control, and it lets you turn like your servos into big beaters and stuff along those lines. It's a little bit weird, right? The fact that she gives herself servos with her first ability lets you kind of use this ability profitably, and there are a couple other artifacts floating around the set, as I've mentioned with Karn, that you might just randomly have in your deck. I think her real selling point is that she makes a 1/1 whenever you cast a spell, which is good for attacking, good for blocking. It can, really incentivize you to cast a lot of instants and mess up your opponent's combat. If they're really troubled by a certain Planeswalker you have on board and they have no choice but to attack it, you can use Saheeli to defend that Planeswalker quite well. I don't think her -2 is going to be game-breaking. I think it's going to come up some amount of the time, and it does incentivize you to draft a couple artifacts a little bit higher, but really you want the passive ability here. I view her kind of as an enchantment more than some of the other Planeswalkers here, but sometimes you'll -2, you'll get a cool little benefit off of it. It's worth noting that the -2 only lasts until the end of your turn, so it's really an effect that's only useful for attacking your opponent, not blocking. So just keep that in mind. She doesn't really block very well with her -2. She blocks well with her passive ability. Moving right along, Domri. Let's all take a moment of silence for Domri, please. Alright, Domri sucks. Anyway, Anarch of Bolas is 1 red-green for a 3 loyalty walker. This one's a rare, and the passive, creatures you control get +1/+0. I'm kind of already sold on that, right? 3 mana, power pumping anthem on a pretty early Planeswalker seems good enough to me, right? It incentivizes you to be aggressive, obviously, but it makes your blocks a little bit better too. But in general, just having a power pumping Anthem on an early play seems decent and really rewards highly aggressive decks. The +1 here is very similar to the Domri we already got in the last set. It adds a red or a green mana to your mana pool, and your creatures can't be countered. There are a couple counter spells in this set. Not many, but it's a nice little upside. Not great, but it's something, right? For the most part, he's ramp. He's going to come down on turn 3. He's going to add a red or a green on turn 4, and you're going to be able to cast a 5-drop if all goes well. The -2 is also quite relevant. It says target creature control fights target creature you don't control. So -2 is straight up Prey Upon, which I believe was an ability on the original Domri as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. So nothing super flashy here, but the combination of effects is nice. You have ramp, you have removal, and you have a static power pumping ability. So I think Domri definitely deserves his rare slot. The one problem is that he's a 3 loyalty walker, and you have to have a lot of other creatures for him to even be relevant. If your hand just sucks or you draw him really late in the game, he's not going to be super, super relevant, but he's always going to be fine at worst. If nothing else, he's going to produce extra mana or give you some extra power on board. So I think he's fine. I don't think he's insane, but I think it's a card you'll be happy first picking most of the time that you see him. Oh, dear God. Tibalt is next. Tibalt, for some reason, everyone's favorite Planeswalker. This version, Rakish Instigator, I don't know, is 2 and a red for a 5 loyalty uncommon Tibalt. Your opponents can't gain life. Okay, well, we haven't seen too much life gain on any of the walkers so far, but there are a couple walkers and a couple incidental life gain spells floating throughout this set, so it's a fine passive, even if it's not something that you're playing Tibalt for. What you really want here is the -2. Create a 1/1 red devil creature token with whenever this creature dies, deals 1 damage to any target. So, you know, those little Innistrad devils, Tibalt makes those. I think this is fine. If you play him for 3 mana and you produce just a single 1/1, that's going to be fine, right? And if you can get a second one, that's going to be quite good. Similar to Vraska, they're decent attackers in the same vein that they are decent blockers, since if your opponent blocks them, you get to ping that damage around no matter what. You can trade those devils up for 2/2. Or you can perhaps ping off your opponent's Planeswalker if it's sitting on board. You can even just ping your opponent. It makes Footlight Fiends, if you will, basically. If you haven't played with those little devil tokens, then think of Tibalt -2, make a Footlight Fiend. And Footlight Fiend's a respectable card at making sure damage is being dealt. There's no spectacle this time around, so if you need to deal damage or you need to just have pesky blockers, then look, Tibalt's going to be fine, even if Tibalt's not super insane, even when you do get to minus him twice in a row. Similar to Saheeli, right, in that he just kind of, or not Saheeli, but Vraska, in that he makes kind of annoying blockers and annoying attackers, but he doesn't exactly carry the game on his back. Ajani is up next. Ajani the Great-Hearted. He has a great heart. It's 2 green-white for a 5 loyalty rare. Your creatures have Vigilance. This is fine. It's not throwaway text. People seem to underrate Vigilance, but when you have big creatures on board, Vigilance can be quite annoying. It lets you pressure your opponent while also playing defense, and this is a set where that's going to be super important, so I think that's a nice little static ability to have. The +1 says you gain 3 life, unless your opponent has a Tibalt on board, then you gain nothing. But it's nice to have a +1 ability that does something, and your opponent can't just ignore it. If they're playing an aggressive deck, they kind of have to deal with Ajani, otherwise you just gain 3 life every single turn, and they're never going to be able to kill you. So Ajani says, hey, I'm the lightning rod, deal with me first. The -2 is the selling point for Ajani. It says put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with a and put a loyalty counter on each other Planeswalker you control. So it anthems your board, similar to Domri, but in a much better fashion, and it anthems your Planeswalkers. This is one of the cool ways to get extra loyalty onto your Planeswalkers. If you look at Tibalt on screen, or you've seen a lot of these other Planeswalkers, they end up at a point where they're just sitting on board with 1 loyalty. They can no longer use any loyalty abilities, they just have their passive. But if you have effects like Ajani's -2, you can actually maybe get an additional activation out of those walkers, which could go a long way in winning some games. So I think Ajani's great. It plays more with, other walkers than some of the walkers do on their own. and it kind of hoses aggro decks unless your opponent does something about the Ajani. So I like him overall. I think he's well balanced. I'm not quite sure he's bomb territory or anything along those lines, since he doesn't really deal with your opponent's board at all, and he requires you to have a bunch of creatures to be super relevant. Imagine you just have one creature when you -2 Ajani. Well, congrats, you got a +1 counter and vigilance out of the deal for 4 mana. That's not great, right? Ajani needs a big board to back him up, and I think when you have the big board, that's going to be great, but similar to Domri, when you don't have the big board, he's going to lose a lot of his appeal. Ob Nixilis the Hate Twisted is next. I'm not sure I meant to put Ob Nixilis in this category. I think he's quite bad, but he's 3 black for a 5 loyalty Nixilis Planeswalker. And the passive says whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage to that player. Sure, that's kind of what you're playing Ob Nixilis for. If you can slow the game down to a crawl, then that's kind of the way you're dealing damage to that player over time. The -2 is very strange. I'm not sure if this is good or not, but it says destroy target creature, its controller draws 2 cards. So I'm not sure. Are you supposed to be killing your opponent's creatures and making them draw 2 cards to deal 2 damage to them with the passive? That sounds all good and stuff, but you just drew your opponent 2 cards. That's a huge deal in Limited. And sure, Ob Nixilis can minus twice, but I'm not sure I would play a sorcery that said destroy target creature, its opponent draws 2 cards. That seems quite bad to me. Where Ob Nixilis gets a little bit interesting is when you target your own creatures, of course. The passive ability only punishes your opponents for drawing cards, not you, so you can destroy one of your own creatures and draw 2 cards. If you have a creature that's no longer relevant, or maybe it's been hit by a pacifism type effect, which there aren't a lot of in the set, and we'll talk about why later on. But yeah, if you can use Ob Nixilis to turn your irrelevant creatures into actual cards, I guess that's fine. But I don't know, the sum of its parts don't really appeal to me here. I think a specific kind of match needs to be going where the board is completely stalled or your opponent's just not beating you down or something like that. I don't know. I'm not sold on Ob Nixilis. I see the potential here. I think that's why I put it in the mid-tier category, but this might have been a little bit of fluke. I think this belongs in the low-tier category. I'll have to see it get played before I really have a strong opinion about whether Ob Nixilis is worth his pick or not. Arlen, I'm a little bit more confident on Arlen. Voice of the Pack, the Pack, is 4 green, 7 loyalty, uncommon. Each creature you control that's a wolf or a werewolf enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and then you can -2 to create a 2/2 wolf creature, which if Arlen is on board, then you're essentially -2 in to make a 3/3. Now, I really wanted to give Arlen a higher nod than this. I wanted to put her in the high tier category, but the problem is she's 6 loyalty or 6 mana to cast this card, right? That's a lot. The upside is that she gets to -2 3 times in a row before she falls off and doesn't do anything. Plus, green just has proliferate cards. There's a little bit of extra upside in that there is 1 or 2 other wolves, or there are a couple other wolves floating around the set. I don't think there are any werewolves. I might be wrong. That's there for flavor reasons, obviously. But if you can pick up some other wolves and then curve into Arlen, then yeah, you've got a little bit of a theme on your hands, but you don't need to go crazy and grab every single wolf to make Arlen good. If you get to 6 mana, you're not in a completely disastrous, situation in the game, and you get to -2 a couple times, then Arlen's great, but 6 mana is a lot, and you're going to have to deal with that. Narset is next. Cool art. Narset, Parter of Veils, is 1 blue, 5 loyalty for an uncommon. Each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. Yeah, that's fine. This is similar to Dovan or something along those lines where, it could mess up incidentally what your opponent's doing, but it's not a huge selling point for the card, especially since a lot of card advantage comes in the form of just putting cards in your hand and not actually drawing extra cards. But anyway, the -2 here says look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it in your hand. The rest go to the bottom. So she kind of gets to dig 4 cards down and get you a spell, and then she gets to do it again, and then she sits there and looks beautiful on board. Narset's fine. I already mentioned Blue-Red has a Spells Matters theme going on in this set, and Narset's a pretty good way to make sure that you're hitting spells, but looking at the top 4, if you're not super heavy on spells, this can miss. And if Narset misses on her first activation, then she's quite bad. And if she gets you the full cards out of both activations, then she's decent, right? Kind of a divination that guarantees you draw 2 actual spells seems fine to me, but doesn't seem game breaking. She doesn't actually interact with the board at all, though, so I don't know if she has a place in the typical game where people are casting things like Arlen and making a bunch of creatures off of them or something along those lines. Just keep that in mind. You need to make sure your spells are worth digging for before you include a Narset in your deck, but if you're a removal heavy control deck or you just have a lot of draw power going on, I think Narset's going to be worth the slot in your deck. And that moves us into the most exciting cards, the top tier high impact Planeswalkers. These are the ones that you basically have to deal with, otherwise they can steal a game, they can kind of turn the tide in your favor. A lot of them are a little bit on the expensive side, but most of them have relevant passive abilities and activated abilities, and these are the ones that you're looking to pick early in a pack. The first one is Kaia, Bane of the Dead, the Orzhov Ghost Council killer, if you will. 3 Orzhov, 6 mana total for an uncommon 7 loyalty Kaia Walker. And it says your opponents and permanents your opponents control with hexproof can be the targets of spells and abilities you control as though they didn't have hexproof. So suck it, Teo, you don't have hexproof anymore. There aren't too many hexproof creatures in this set, but Kaia's kind of there to just say no to hexproof. Hexproof no longer works while Kaia's on board, which is relevant because her -3 says, boom, exile target creature. That's just a great ability, right? If this was 6 mana, sorcery, exile target creature, you would play that card. It wouldn't be premium removal, but you would play it, and Kaia has the upside of being able to -3 once again and exile another target creature. So she is expensive, but unlike Arlen Cord, she is always going to get her man, if you will, right? Keep in mind, when you resolve a Planeswalker, you have priority to activate one of the abilities right away before your opponent can interact. So as long as Kaia sticks on board, she's going to be able to exile a creature. The awkward thing about Kaia, and the reason she's not one of the best bombs in the set, is that if your opponent is winning with Planeswalkers or winning with some sort of enchantment or artifact, if you will, and they don't actually have relevant creatures on board, Kaia doesn't do anything, right? She doesn't have any card advantage tacked onto her. She doesn't plus at all. She simply kills creatures, and that's all she does. So if your opponent's not winning with a creature, then you just have a stalled out board and you're losing to some sort of Planeswalker on board, then sorry, Kaia's not going to do the trick. Angrath is up next. Angrath, Captain of Chaos, 2 and Rakdos hybrid mana, 4 mana total for a 5 loyalty uncommon walker. Creatures you control have menace. That's a pretty good passive, right? This is along the lines of Domri's +1/+0 to all of your creatures, where it just incentivizes you to be super aggressive. And this is a Planeswalker killer, right? Maybe Angrath directly doesn't kill your opponent's Planeswalkers, but if you have 3/2 creatures attacking with menace, your opponent's just not going to be able to block all of your creatures, and you're going to be able to get some damage in, whether it's against your opponent or against their Planeswalkers. So already I like 4 mana, all of your creatures have menace, and on top of that you have -2, amass 2. We haven't really talked about amass in this video, but essentially if you don't have an army on board, you create an army with 2 counters on it, and if you already have an army, then you just put 2 counters on the army you already have. So it's kind of cool that Angrath uses one of the set mechanics as its minus, and you see here something very similar to Arlen Cord, where he amasses to make a 2/2, but a lot of times you'll already have an army on board, and you get to amass to just make that army bigger. The weird thing is, sometimes you would rather have 2 2/2s than a 4/4, or you'd rather have multiple bodies than to build up one big body, especially if your opponent has like Vraska and a Death Toucher on board, but you don't have control over that. Angrath has to amass onto an army if you already have an army on board, which could sometimes be worse than making an actual 2/2. So I think there will be some lines of play where you attack with your army, you force your opponent to deal with it, maybe trade off, maybe use a removal spell, and then you -2 Angrath again to make another 2/2. But I think Angrath's quite good. The combination of making a relevant creature, potentially making it even bigger the turn after, and giving all of your creatures a relevant combat-related ability for your aggressive decks makes Angrath a pretty high pick. Oh boy, Teferi, another Teferi. We got to keep breaking Teferi. Teferi, the Time Reveler, or I'm sorry, the Time Raveler, is 1 white and a blue for a 4 loyalty rare Teferi. Each opponent can cast spells only anytime they could cast a sorcery. This is a little bit more annoying than something like Narset's not being able to draw multiple cards or Dovan's taxing instants and sorceries. This basically just makes it very safe to play on your turn against instant heavy decks, right? If your opponent has shown you a bunch of counter spells or a bunch of instant speed removal, Teferi gets to kind of lock those down, or at least it makes it so that your opponent has to play all their removal and play all their tricks at sorcery speed. It makes combat tricks a lot worse for the opponent. It basically turns off counter spells altogether and makes them useless. So Teferi's got some actual upside, but against some decks, that just won't matter. For the most part, it's going to be good against other blue decks or combat trick heavy decks. And sometimes, like I said, it won't matter at all. Anyway, Teferi's abilities, +1. Until your next turn, you may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash. That's very dependent on how many sorceries you actually have in your deck. A lot of times I tend to draft a bunch of instants over sorceries, but there are enough sorceries in the set that should matter. And even if it doesn't do anything, it's the only way you have to plus Teferi. So if you want to -3 them multiple times, then you better start giving your sorceries instant speed. The real selling point here, -3, return up to 1 target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand, draw a card. If this didn't draw a card, it'd be a little bit weak, but the fact that you can play this on turn 3, -3, bounce your opponent's only creature, draw a card, you're basically even on cards, and then you can start plussing and maybe threatening to deal with your opponent's cards at instant speed, even with your sorceries. I think Teferi's really cool, and it could be the type of Planeswalker to dominate a game if it's backed up with the right spell suite, right? Teferi on its own isn't going to win a game. It can only deal with something once every, 3 turns, 4 turns, whatever. But if you back it up with a bunch of sweet spells, a bunch of removal, a bunch of bounce spells, or maybe some better Planeswalkers, then I think it's going to be very good, and it could run away with the game. Nice to have that draw card attached to the -3. That's really what ups the power level of this card. Again, not broken, or at least not broken in limited, but quite good otherwise. Sauron's next. Sauron has one of the most ridiculous passive abilities here, but Sauron Vengeful Bloodlord, 2 white, black, for a 4 loyalty rare walker. Thank God this one's rare. As long as it's your turn, creatures and planeswalkers you control have lifelink. Bingo, creatures you control have lifelink. Have you ever played with that sort of ability in limited? It makes you essentially impossible to kill, right? Now it is only on your turn. If you're blocking, then you don't have lifelink unless your creatures already have it. But it's also kind of cool that your planeswalkers have lifelink, which is going to be relevant for some of the red walkers that can deal damage. Including Sauron himself, not red, but you get the point. Sauron's +2 says, deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. It's just a ping, right? But it does have lifelink, so you're going to gain that 1 life, and this can pick off really small creatures or annoy your opponent's planeswalkers. I'm sorry, I actually misread that. It can't deal damage to creatures, only players or planeswalkers, so it cannot pick off your opponent's small creatures. But it can still annoy your opponent's planeswalkers. It's a good way to kind of just make sure your opponent's planeswalkers don't get to, proliferate when they're sitting there on 1 counter. You can just ping them off and get them off the board. Make sure your opponent can't get value of having, just a 1 loyalty planeswalker sitting on board. Sauron's -X says, return target creature card with converted mana cost X from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature is a vampire in addition to its other types. I think that's mostly flavor. Again, I haven't seen every single card in the set, but I don't think vampires matter for any of the cards in the set. That's just there because, Sauron, vampire. Haha. This is kind of cool, though. Sauron can come down and reanimate a 3 mana cost creature from your library, so it has a very familiar line of play that we saw with the newest Ajani from M19. Adversary of Tyrants or something like that, where you're incentivized to trade off early in the game and then play this planeswalker, bring that creature back, and suddenly it's like you didn't trade off at all, and you're up on card advantage on board, and then you get to start plussing. Sauron also has a +2, which is worth mentioning here, because we've seen a lot of +1s, but not a lot of +2s. +1 or +2 to deal a damage, gain a life is an actual clock. It's like the world's worst ill-gotten inheritance without the activated ability. Your opponent can't ignore Sauron, which I like a lot, and he kind of protects himself with the -X ability. Not always, but for the most part, he will be protecting himself. And sometimes you'll have another walker on board that can take advantage of having lifelink, which is kind of cool. So overall, 2 thumbs up for Sauron Vengeful Bloodlord in my book. Even if I don't think he's the flashiest thing in the world, he should be a little bit difficult to deal with. Ral, Storm Conduit, this card, I talked about this in a previous video, but let's talk about it again. Storm Conduit is 2 blue-red for 4 loyalty. This one's a rare, and it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery or copy an instant or sorcery, Ral deals 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So similar to Sauron, this one can't hit creatures with its passive ability, but it lets you turn all of your spells into damage. And then whenever you copy a spell, you also get to deal damage, which matters for some of the cards in this set, plus his -2, which we'll talk about. The +2 is kind of really boring. It's just Scry 1, right? This looks like one of those Planeswalker intro deck Planeswalker abilities, but I don't know. Scry 1, it's not nothing, and it's a +2. So Ral gets up there pretty early on. And then the +2 lets you consistently use the -2, which is where all the meat is. Whenever you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. So in a deck with a bunch of removal, Ral is going to be a real house. As long as you can play him and you can survive to the point where you get to -2, basically any interactive spell in your hand is going to be a huge blowout because you'll cast the spell, you'll get Ral's kind of initial trigger off casting a card and deal damage to your opponent, and then the -2 will copy that spell, so you'll get an additional copy of whatever you were casting, and then Ral will trigger again because you copied an instant or sorcery. So you're getting 2 damage every time you effectively use a spell after -2ing, plus you get 2 activations of whatever spell you were casting, right? If you cast just, 2 mana, deal 3 damage to target creature, then you basically get to fork that and deal 3 damage to another creature while also shocking the opponent, and that's a lot of damage. So if you can keep the board clear and you have enough burn spells, Ral could be your win condition altogether. It does require you to have a very spell-heavy deck, but I think it pays you off a little bit better than something like Saheeli does for casting a bunch of instants or sorceries, and that's why I have it a whole tier higher than Saheeli. Chandra's next, the Fire Artisan. Out of context, this would be really weird art for Chandra, but I'm kind of cool with it. Fire Artisan is 2 red, 4 loyalty, rare, and it says whenever 1 or more loyalty counters are removed from Chandra, she deals that much damage to target opponent or planeswalker. Again, not hitting creatures, but it's kind of cool. So we'll talk about this all together. Let's read the rest of her first. The +1 is kind of a typical Chandra ability. Exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. You do still have to pay the mana cost. If it's a land, you can play it. And if you don't play it at all, it just stays in exile for all eternity. So she has card advantage attached to her, which is something that red doesn't get very well. It's a little bit of temporary card advantage. You have to be able to use that card right away. So, a lot of times you'll tap out for her on turn 4 and +1, and you'll just lose whatever card that is. But it gets her loyalty up, and that's the big part there. Every time you plus, you're adding to her loyalty, and you get close to the option of going -7, which says exile the top 7 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So you get kind of a huge surge of spells for the turn. You can play as many of them as possible. Yes, same thing we said about the +1. You have to pay the mana cost for all of them. But the huge selling point here is actually the passive ability that says whenever loyalty counters are removed from Chandra, you get to dome your opponent or an opponent's planeswalker equal to the number of counters that were removed. So your opponent can't just sit here and ignore Chandra, because then it'll -7. Your opponent will get 7 cards, and you will get to dome your opponent for 7 or just straight up kill one of their planeswalkers. However, if you start attacking Chandra, every time you attack her and deal damage to her, she gets to dome the opponent anyway. So she's good for 4 damage at least, right? She starts at 4 loyalty, and if she takes 4 damage, you get to deal 4 damage to your opponent. Every time she pluses, it kind of changes the threshold for the amount of damage she does. Now, if your opponent just straight up destroys Chandra and uses a spell that says destroy target planeswalker or something like that, then Chandra won't actually do anything. But most of the time, the way you're dealing with a planeswalker is by attacking it or dealing damage to it. and Chandra sits there and pluses and pluses and pluses and says, all right, are you going to deal with me? If not, I'm going to draw 7 cards, and if you do deal with me, you're going to take a bunch of damage for it. So I think this is one of the more unique Planeswalkers. It's going to be kind of difficult to play with and play around this card. I think you're incentivized to try and kill it as early as possible before your opponent actually gets a lot of card advantage off of it. But if you're at a really low life total, maybe your opponent's been playing a really aggressive red deck and then they slam Chandra, you're kind of in a really bad spot because you have to kill it before it can -7, and you can't kill it if your life total is too low. Super cool card. Again, like Ral, double thumbs up. Even if it's not the most reliable source of damage and it doesn't interact with your opponent's creatures, it is card advantage and it's a super cool design. Jace is next. Kind of hate Jace, but he's got a shirt on it this time. Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. 1 blue, 4 loyalty, rare. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. Sure, you can set that up. I don't really care about that here. If you win with the Laboratory Maniac ability, then cool. That's a cool story, but I don't think that's really what you want to be doing. You're not first picking Jason saying, all right, I'm going to self-mill. Like, sure, I guess you could do that, but it's not going to win as many games as just taking Jace because he's a card advantage machine, right? The +1 here is basically all you need to know about Jace. Target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, draw a card. +1, draw a card. Sure, you can mill 2. Basically, you're incentivized to target yourself so that Jace can ultimate or Jace can get you down to 0 cards and then you win, but I don't know. I don't think Jace is really that good outside of just drawing a card. Don't mill your opponent either. It's just not really doing anything for you. I don't know. This could be a mill win condition against your opponent too, but like I said with Shiok, there's not a lot to actually support a mill deck outside of a couple Planeswalkers. The -8 says draw 7 cards, and then if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. Similar to, what was it, Samit? That's there in case Jace dies from activating the ability. You still kind of get the passive ability in the actual activation. This is like, I think, a weaker Chandra. You get to draw the card and keep the card, but it doesn't it has no way to protect itself, right? Jace doesn't make creatures. It doesn't punish your opponent for attacking him. It's triple blue, so sometimes you won't even be able to cast it on turn 4. And if you do cast it on turn 4, you have nothing to back it up, then you need to draw quite a few cards before it's worth playing, right? If you just play a Jace, you plus, and then it dies, you paid 4 mana for a Divination, and that's not very exciting. So I think Jace is pretty good at being a card advantage engine. Just going +1, draw a card is, not something we're going to see on every single Planeswalker here. In fact, we haven't seen draw a card on a lot of the Planeswalkers. Even Chandra is a little bit of an impulse draw, and Ral has Scry 1 instead of draw a card. So straight up draw a card on a plus is quite good, and that's why I put Jace in this top tier, but I could kind of care less about all the fluff about having no cards in your library. Kasmina is next. This is kind of high impact just because I like the art, but, spare me here. Kasmina, Enigmatic Mentor, is 2 and a blue for a 5 loyalty walker. This one's uncommon, and it says spells your opponent's cast that target a creature or planeswalker you control cost 2 more to cast. That's not throwaway text. Like a lot of this other text we mentioned on Narset and we mentioned on Dovan. I kind of said those taxing abilities just aren't that great. In the case of Kasmina, they are great, right? Because a lot of the removal in this set is actually very, very efficient, and we'll see that when we get into the rest of the videos, but the removal is very good in this set, and making your opponent basically tap out to deal with a threat seems really good. It also means that they kind of have to deal with Kasmina before they deal with a lot of other threats, otherwise they're just going to be taxed to the point where, they can't deal with everything. Kasmina also has a very relevant -2, which says create a 2/2 blue wizard creature token, draw a card, then discard a card. So not straight up card advantage. It is a loot, and it's a forced loot. You don't have the option to not discard a card or not draw a card, but at least you stay even at worst. So you will always loot here and make a 2/2. Kasmina's wizards are fine. She makes 2/2s. They don't have fly-in, they don't have evasion, but they're bodies. They can block, they can attack, and she makes 2 of them if she survives for 2 turns, so that's fine too. I wish they had flying to make Kasmina a little bit better, but I understand she's an uncommon walker, so they don't. And yeah, I think overall you get a nice little package here that's going to create a couple bodies and make it harder for your opponent to deal with your stuff. Note that it does tax your opponent for trying to deal with your Planeswalkers too, which is quite nice. It doesn't tax their abilities though. It only taxes their spells. So your opponent can still use maybe the loyalty ability of a Planeswalker to deal with another Planeswalker. So that's a little bit of an awkward kind of hiccup with the card, but it doesn't take away from it being an early pick for me altogether. And again, she's a nice package. I think you will be happy playing Kasmina in your blue decks. Jaya's up next. Jaya, the Venerated Fire Mage, is 4 and a red for a 5 loyalty uncommon walker. This one has, I don't know what you call this ability, but we've seen it on a couple other cards. It basically says if a red source you control deals damage to anything, it deals an additional damage to that thing. And then her -2 says, deal 2 damage to any target, which with her ability is 3 damage. This one's a little bit different than Jace or Sama. If Jaya dies, if she's at exactly 2 loyalty and she -2s, she will only deal 2 damage instead of the 3 damage that you normally get off of her, because she will not be on board and her passive ability won't be there when her activated loyalty ability resolves. So just keep that in mind. If she dies, -N, she will only deal 2 damage, but I think she's still fine. She's going to come down, deal 3 damage to something, probably kill it. And then if they don't kill Jaya, she gets the -3 again, probably kills something else. And the fact that she deals damage to any target makes her a nice little Planeswalker killer, right? A lot of times your opponent is going to play a card like Kasmina, and then they're going to minus, and that Planeswalker is going to be on 3 loyalty. And then Jaya is going to come down and say, fireball to the face, your Planeswalker is dead, and Jaya is now going to be sitting on board with another activation. Not to mention, your other red sources are going to deal additional damage. So things like the Tybalt Devils now deal 2 damage when they block and 2 damage when they ping and stuff along that line. Plus, every red creature you control just has an extra damage tacked on to whatever it blocks or whatever it's attacking, so on and so forth. So I think altogether you get a nice little red card here. I don't know, I'm not really comparing the cards within this category, but I think these are all pretty close. If I had to give context here, I'd say Jaya is a little bit better, more focused of a card than something like Jace, and Jaya does actually protect herself and protect your other card, so I think she's quite good, a little bit better than some of the other cards, but she is just damage, right? And she will just fall off at a certain point. It is nice that Jaya is one of the ones that has a very relevant passive ability, even when she's sitting there on -1 or on a single loyalty, that your red sources are still going to deal extra damage. So I think you'll be happy to have her. Again, not game busting, right? You can deal with Jaya. Jaya is not going to just win the game on her own, but she's going to be very good at interacting with whatever your opponent's doing. Vivian's up next. Vivian, Champion of the Wild. 2 in a green. 4 loyalty. This one's rare, and it says you may cast creature spells as though they had flash. If this was a 3-mana enchantment that said you may cast things with flash, your creatures, that's close to playable, but not quite, right? It does mean every one of your creatures is now an instant. You can play kind of this game where your opponent has to really think about whether they can attack into you, and you can just hold up mana and hold up your creatures, and you never have to run them into sorcery speed stuff pre-combat and stuff like that. But Vivian thankfully has a little bit more that makes her stronger than just that. For one, her +1 says until your next turn up to 1 target creature gains vigilance and reach. This is a very defensive ability, but as I said with the Johnny, giving vigilance to your creatures in this set means that they can pressure your opponent's planeswalkers or pressure your opponent in general, while also playing defense for your planeswalkers and your cards like Vivian, blah, blah, blah. You also don't need to have a creature on board to +1, so she can just come down and +1 right away. The -2 is the real bread and butter of this card. It's a really sweet ability. It says, look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And as long as that card remains exiled, you're allowed to look at it, and you may cast it if it's a creature. If Vivian leaves the board, you can't flash it in anymore, but as long as Vivian is on board, you can flash that creature, which is super sweet. Note that if you look at 3 cards and none of them are a creature, you're still going to exile one, and your opponent doesn't know what that card is, so they have to play around it being a creature that you can flash in, even if it's not, which is awesome, right? Plus, if it is a creature, or if you just have a bunch of creatures in your hand, you can just kind of 2-for-1 your opponent over and over again, as long as your creatures are good blockers, right? I think Vivien is super sweet. She comes down early enough to have a relevant impact on the board by giving your creatures, some sort of evasive ability, not evasion, but kind of defensive ability. It stops your opponent's flyers in their track if you have good green creatures. And then her -2 is an actual kind of machine, right? Also worth noting before we move on from Vivien, if she dies, the way the -2 is worded, you can still cast that creature even if Vivien dies. You just won't be able to flash it in. Sarkhan the Masterless up next, another really sweet design on a Planeswalker. It's 3 red, 5 loyalty altogether for a 5 loyalty. This one's rare. It says whenever a creature attacks you or a Planeswalker you control, each dragon you control deals 1 damage to that creature. I'm not sure if there are any other dragons in this set. There might be one. I'm not 100% sure, but anyway, Sarkhan makes his own dragon, so just keep that in mind. The +1 here, which is really weird, says until end of turn, each Planeswalker you control becomes a 4/4 red dragon creature token and gains flying. I am not 100% sure if that makes it so that they can no longer use their loyalty abilities. Like, does it take away their other abilities, or are they still Planeswalkers in addition to being dragons? That I'm not clear on. What I do know is if you have 2 or 3 Planeswalkers on board and you +1 him, your opponent is dead. It also basically affects himself a lot of times. You +1 to turn Sarkhan into a dragon, and then that dragon can attack. It does make all of your Planeswalkers more vulnerable, right? Because now opens up creature removal to be able to kill your Planeswalkers, so you got to be a little bit careful when you +1. Also note that if you play Sarkhan and you +1 right away, he will not have haste, so he won't be able to attack that turn, but you're probably going to -3 him when you play him most of the time anyway. The -3 is pretty simple. Make a 4/4 dragon creature token with flying, which then turns on his passive ability. So as long as you have that dragon on board, if your opponent attacks anything at all, you get to just ping all of their creatures for each dragon you control. If somehow you ever get a second dragon on board, then your opponent's creatures are taking 2 damage just by attacking before blocks are even declared, and this can just stop an opponent in their tracks, right? All of their 1 toughness creatures are irrelevant attackers while Sarkhan's on board, and he makes a 4/4, right? It's not bomb territory. This isn't the best Planeswalker in the set because, we wouldn't say a 5-mana 4/4 dragon that makes attacks a little bit harder is some insane super bomb, but I do think it's quite good, and I can see Sarkhan coming down with a board of 2 or 3 walkers and just ending the game. So I think Sarkhan, another Planeswalker that gets the double thumbs up, and another Planeswalker gets the extra thumbs up for being a little bit unique here with his +1 ability. And we've been talking forever and ever and ever, so we're going to get to the final Planeswalkers here, the God tier Planeswalkers, the bombs of the set. These are the ones that will completely steal the game and destroy your opponent, and if your opponent can't deal with them, the game is over. You'll notice that a lot of these have something in common, and that is that they interact with the board while plussing and making the game harder for your opponent to deal with as each turn goes by. So let's go ahead and start off with Ugin, the Ineffable. Can't F with this. 6 mana for a colorless 4 loyalty Ugin Walker. This is a rare Planeswalker, and it says your colorless spells cost 2 less to cast. That doesn't matter too much. There's a couple cool cards here. There's like a colorless X spell that works pretty nicely with Ugin, but for the most part, Ugin has a pretty throwaway static ability for limited. What I'm really interested in here, and I think the really kind of selling point of it, is the plus. Like I said, a lot of these god tier Planeswalkers, they plus to make creatures and protect themselves. In this case, Ugin exiles the top card of your library face down, and then you create a 2/2 colorless spirit token, and if that token ever leaves the battlefield, you get to put the exiled card into your hand. So he pluses to make 2/2s, which is already pretty good, but then if your opponent deals with the 2/2s, or you block with them, or they block the 2/2s while you're attacking with them, you get to just add cards to your hand, which is kind of nice, and you do get to look at the cards that are exiled. So once Ugin pluses a couple times, you get to kind of swing and block in a way that you're going to draw the cards that you really need that are exiled. Ugin with just the +1 is awesome, but he also has a very relevant -3 that says destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. In other words, destroy basically any permanent that's not a land. There are, a couple colorless creatures, a couple artifact creatures that Ugin can't destroy, but Ugin will destroy every other planeswalker except for Karn. It will destroy any creature that's in the way. It will destroy any enchantment. Anything that is in the way, Ugin can deal with it. And if you don't have to do that, you get to start plussing. The real selling point here, even though Ugin doesn't just bleed power, it doesn't just scream wow amazing, and I think a lot of people are latching on to it being expensive, is that he's colorless. You can first pick this and play it in literally any single deck, and he will be good. So Ugin gets the highest praise out of me compared to all of the other planeswalkers we have dealt with so far. In fact, he kills all of them except for Karn. So there's that, and I think that kind of sells it for me. Next up, we have Nissa, who shakes the world. It's a little bit annoying, the world shaking, but nonetheless, this Nissa is 3 green, 5 mana total, 5 loyalty. This one's a rare. Whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. So your forest tap for double green. Kind of nice. The +1 here, similar to Ugin, makes creatures. You put 3 +1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. You untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that's still a land, and it stays that way. It doesn't stop being a creature. There's a lot to talk about with just the +1, so let's get to it. First off, you can't put additional counters on a creature that's already land. You have to target a non-creature land. So if you +1 on a forest, you have to +1 on a different forest the turn after. It doesn't have to even just target forests. Second off, Nissa untaps whatever land you're targeting, so you can use this as mana ramp. The turn you play Nissa, you can +1 to untap one of the forests, and then tap it right away for 2 more green mana. Or the turn after you play Nissa, maybe she's already at 6 loyalty, you can +1 to just have, 7, 8, 10 mana that turn. You can cast basically your entire hand. The thing, too, is that might look like a downside, turning your lands into creatures because your opponent kills your lands and then suddenly you're down mana, but Nissa gives you additional mana out of all of your forests, so being down a land is not as big of a deal as it would normally seem. And then I don't even care that much about the emblem. I think the +1 and the static ability work well enough together to make this a bomb, but the -8 is there as well, which says you get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forests, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So you will never draw a forest again for the rest of that game. All of your lands are indestructible, so anything that you've turned into a 3/3 with a +1 ability is just there to stay. It's going to block forever. It has vigilance, so it can attack forever, and she can just keep plussing on the rest of the forest that you get with the emblem. So I think Nissa is fantastic. I don't think there are any other cards that I'm passing up for a Nissa here, or at least everything that's below this god tier, this bomb category, I am not picking this up over a Nissa. And I don't think she reads like she's super powerful, but I guarantee you this card will steal games and it's going to be very annoying. She kind of gets around the normal drawback of losing your lands with her +1 ability in combat by making up for it by giving you additional mana out of your forests. And I think that makes for a good combination of abilities on a very strong planeswalker. Liliana, this is a card that it's very easy to just see why it's super powerful, but let's read it real quick. 4 black. This one is mythic rare. It's 6 loyalty to start off with, and it says whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. That is an insane passive ability. Your opponent has to get in combat to deal with your walkers or deal with you. Creatures are going to die, and this doesn't even say non-token creatures. If a creature you control dies, you're up a card. That means every single creature you have that trades off is going to be a 2-for-1, and your opponent is just going to fall behind in that card advantage. And she starts at 6 loyalty while plussing to make tokens. Her plus says make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. That's insane. Similar to Nissa, who pluses to make 3/3s, or Ugin that pluses to make 2/2s, Liliana pluses to make 2/2s, but these ones draw you a card no matter what when they die. Similar to Ugin, which is why I say Ugin's fantastic. It's hard for me to look at people seriously when they know that Liliana's a bomb, and then say that Ugin's not a bomb when they have very similar pluses on them. The -4 is a little finicky, but it should stabilize a game for you. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. A lot of times this is annoying when you have to sacrifice your own creatures if you played them before playing Liliana, but any of your creatures that die draw you a card, so quite nice. And if your opponent only has a couple creatures on board, then you get the minus, sweep the board, draw some cards, and then you just plus, 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 plus. Your opponent has to deal with your zombies to get to Liliana. You draw, 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 draw. The game slips out of control from there on. And then she has a -9 that says each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the lands, or sacrifices the rest. They're down to 1 land, they're down to 1 creature, 1 planeswalker. They're just out of the game, essentially, unless their 1 creature is some ridiculous card, or their 1 planeswalker is some ridiculous planeswalker like a Liliana of their own. And even then, you probably still have your Lily on board. I think it's pretty obvious to see that this Liliana is a bomb and mythic rare for a reason. Notably, there are only 3 mythic rare planeswalkers, and they're all going to show up right in this category. But yeah, similar to Ugin, similar to Nissa, she pluses to make tokens. This one's a little bit stronger, I think, in that she minuses to potentially sweep the board and be like kind of the ultimate form of protection. And then she has a -9 that basically says your opponent doesn't get to play Magic anymore. Pretty easy hit for me. I think this is a well-deserved mythic and an exceptionally strong card that you're first picking anytime you see it. Gideon Blackblade is next. 1 white, 4 loyalty. Mythic rare, again. A little bit weird. It says, as long as it's your turn, Gideon Blackblade is a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him on your turn. So your opponent can't just burn him on your turn. It's weird. He's a planeswalker and a creature at the same time, which is not something that we see a lot. Most of the time when you turn a Gideon into a planeswalker, into a creature, I think he stops being a planeswalker. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I know he still has like loyalty on him or something. I don't 100% know how it works. I imagine this Gideon is going to lead to rules questions with him being a planeswalker and a creature and being indestructible and preventing damage and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, this is essentially a 3-mana 4/4 indestructible on your turn that also has some activated abilities. The +1 says up to 1 other target creature you control gains your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Indestructible until end of turn. That's a nice combination of abilities. Lifelink, if you need to race. Vigilance, if you need to make sure you have blockers. Indestructible, if you need to make sure you have good attackers. It's just really good versatility, and it turns your other creatures into actual threats, even if they might not be that threatening. Plus, Gideon's a 4/4 Indestructible. Like, you're just going to be able to mow down your opponent or their planeswalkers pretty easily, I think. And then -6 says exile target non-land permanent. We saw this similarly with Ugin. We saw this similarly with Kaia. The only difference with Gideon is that he can't activate that ability right away. He actually has to build up to it, which is weird. This is one of the first planeswalkers that can't just do its protection ability right away. Liliana gets to sack 2 creatures right away. Nissa can't -8, but she doesn't really have a destroy target creature ability on her. Kaia can come down in -3, so on and so forth, right? Gideon gets to go +++, and then -6. I believe if Gideon is at 6 loyalty and you -6 him, he dies. Again, the kind of templating of making this a creature and a planeswalker at the same time is confusing to me and will be confusing to other people, but just know that the power level is here. If nothing else, ignore the fact that he's a planeswalker and that he's a 4/4 indestructible on your turn, which is pretty good for 3 mana. And last but not least, it would not be God tier if we didn't put the Dragon God himself in here. This one has a caveat, but hey, it has Raymond Swanland art, and look at that print. Why is it so clear compared to the rest of them? I have no idea. Anyway, let's wrap this video up with our final walker, Nikolas Dragon God. Dat mana cost, blue, black, 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 red. Wow. Okay, all colored mana. You probably can't cast this. That's the caveat. You have to be able to cast Nikolas for him to be the God tier bomb. He's realistic, probably like a notch below all of the other walkers on this side, since he is virtually uncastable in some decks and very hard to cast even in decks that are splashing. But there's some mana fixing in the set, so I'm not going to count it out. His abilities are definitely worthy of being next to, Liliana and Ugin. 4 loyalty, pretty low to start off with, but he's 5 mana, so it's not too bad. Nikolas Dragon God has all loyalty abilities of all other planeswalkers on the battlefield. Wow, that has the potential to be extremely powerful, giving your deck maybe like abilities that you just didn't even know you had that interact in ways you weren't expecting. If your opponent has like a Nissa on board, you can use Nikolas as ramp, which is just not something you'd be expecting. Or if your opponent has a Liliana, you can start plus and Nikolas to make zombies, right? Nikolas has a lot of broken potential there. If there's a Planeswalker with a plus like Rouse Eric on board, and you can start plus 2ing Nikolas, that gets you to his -3 much, much quicker, being able to do it more times. The -3 here, similar to Ugin, destroy target creature or Planeswalker. There's a permanent in the way, get rid of it, right? Nikolas can come down, stay at 1 loyalty. Pretty rough range to be in, but just take a permanent off the board. A lot of times that's how Planeswalkers play out, right? You pay 5 mana, you have your Planeswalker, you get rid of the major threat, and then you start plussing from there. I completely skipped over his actual +1 too, which is you draw a card, each opponent exiles a card from their hand or a permanent they control. So that doesn't sound super strong, but we said with Jace, right? I put Jace in the high pick category, the high impact category, simply because he pluses the draw a card. Nikolas does that while also putting your opponent down a resource as well. There is a point in the game where they might be able to just exile lands, but they can't do that forever. And, eventually they'll run out of cards in their hand. They'll run out of kind of dirtily permanents to get rid of, and they'll have to actually get rid of good permanents. And once they get to that point, Nikolas just starts taking over the game. And then the -8, kind of cool, kind of flavorful. Each opponent who doesn't control a legendary creature or Planeswalker loses the game. Clearly, you wouldn't -8 unless you could clearly get rid of all of the outliers to this ability. If your opponent has a Planeswalker on board, don't -8 Gideon. It doesn't, or rather Nikolas, it doesn't do anything. But if your coast is clear and Nikolas is at 8, then -8 and you win the game. It's kind of cool. I'm looking forward to seeing that happen, but there are a ton of legendary creatures and Planeswalkers floating around, so keep in mind you have to deal with those first. But Nikolas has enough other nuance in his plus and his -3 and whatever other random abilities he might have from other Planeswalkers on board. And dang, that art. It's going to be really sweet to have this card. Just if you can cast it, it's going to be awesome. And if you can't cast it and you first pick it, then start looking for some mana rocks. Because, yeah, if you can cast Nikolas, it is a god tier bomb. If you can't cast him or you're struggling, then he loses a little bit of his luster, which is not something we can say about Ugin, Gideon, Nissa, or Liliana, who are all monocolored, or in the case of Ugin, no color. So yeah, Nikolas, final one here. Good way to go out. I believe the Dragon God belongs in the God tier. And that covers every single Planeswalker. That's a lot of talking. A lot of kind of predicting, and I'm interested to see which ones I'll be right and wrong about as we look back on this set after pre-releases and initial drafts and stuff like that. It's a lot, so if you agree, if you disagree, if you're even still watching, let me know so we can wrap this video up. Let me know what you agree with. What Planeswalkers am I wrong about? Which ones did I hit spot on? Which ones are you most excited to play? Which ones did I misread or misevaluate? I have no idea. It's hard to evaluate 36 Planeswalkers all at once. But hopefully the rest of these videos will be a little bit shorter. So we won't be talking as much about the Planeswalkers. You won't have to hear me say the word Planeswalker over and over. And we'll start up with the rest of the set with the white cards. All of the white cards minus the white Planeswalkers that we've already talked about in the next video. So as always, thank you for watching. My name is Timothy here with Mana Rocks. I will see you